Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorgen, and I'm here with London Paul. And Paul, in the second part of our discussion on Syria, one of the things that we have to take a look at here is the aftermath and how many different countries are going to be affected by this, for all intents and purposes, nearly bloodless regime change in Syria. Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being a part of this discussion. And what are some of the important players and what are their roles going to be now that Syria has changed hands?
Well, obviously, first off, thanks for joining me as well, Ken. It's a pleasure as ever. Yeah, we wanted to discuss some current developments. Okay, it's very fluid, things are constantly changing, and in kind of no particular order, just pick our way through, some interesting points and developments that are going to unfold in the coming weeks and months. I think the first thing to start with, okay, there's supposed to be this transition government in Syria. And people automatically assumed that it would be HTS. It appears that's not the case, although their involvement is not clear at this point in time, so we have to be extremely careful what we mean. But apparently, there's a person called Mohammed al-Bashir, who in political terms is quite young. Apparently, he's about 41 years of age. He's supposed to be a new transition leader. I mean, and the belief is, well, this could be a step towards removing sanctions and begin the reconstruction of Syria with what he's perceived to be a moderate figure as a leader. Now, I don't know this person, so I can't comment one way or the other, but he was a politician who was serving as the prime minister of what is termed the Syrian Salvation Government, the SSG. That's been since the beginning of this year. And that basically administers this greater Idlib region in northern Syria. I have to confess, I wasn't aware that was even the case. But you can't focus on everything but Syria along with everything else going on in the world at the same time. Now, prior to being his appointment as prime minister, he served as the Minister of Development within the SSG, and this was looking at technology, economics projects, and using an e-government system to improve infrastructure, to deal with unemployment and supporting displaced people. Now, his election was obviously overseen in that region by a whole bunch of representatives, including a council which is supposed to be responsible for legislation, laws, etc., etc. Now, he's spoken apparently this al-Bashir about wanting to make significant technological progress, economic development, and they're going to focus on rebuilding and developing in the liberated areas of northern Syria, whatever that means, because I thought, effectively the whole country is supposed to be liberated from an Assad perspective, that is. And now remains to be seen what actually happens, but this might be an encouraging development. It'd be extremely, I think, important to not see so-called moderate rebels running a country. Obviously, if this is a sort of hybrid government that's in place for a period of time, and it's too early to say whether that is the case or not, may leading eventually to a transition to whatever governance structure is in eventually. Now, let's be extremely careful because I don't want people saying you're being very naive, claim this is, I'm not saying anything of the sort. I'm not claiming this is going to work. These are the current developments. We have to see what the outcome is. I'm not particularly optimistic by this. I mean, we have to hope there is a development, but this might tie in with the fact that perhaps these kind of discussions are being had previously with Assad and the Syrians going, it's time for some change, and he's resolutely not wanted to do so. And you can understand why. Okay, subsequently, that's an irrelevance. I think another point worth making, Ken, is there's two Russian bases there. And this is the military facilities. I always find this difficult to pronounce, the Hamamim Air Base in Latakia and the naval base in Tartus. Now, Tartus is Russia's Mediterranean repair and replacement hub, and Moscow's used it to fly military contractors in and out of Africa, for argument's sake, amongst other functions. So the initial claim is, according to HTS, that Russia's welcome to stay there. On whether that's a short-term, long-term basis, we don't know. But is Russia going to have a presence there? And if Russia does in the future, that is extremely interesting, because the argument would always have been, well, the Iranians aren't welcome here, neither are the Russians. They're also understanding the Iranians are in discussions also with this new interim government. So maybe this is part of this agreement where there were already discussions being had with a kind of quasi-interim government in the making, with the Turks, with the Russians, with the Iranians, possibly. And now we're starting to see further discussions, which is why the Russians haven't been kicked out. And obviously, it remains to be seen what happens with the Iranians, because they have left, I think, their embassy in Damascus. And I think a lot of Iranians have left the country. It remains to be seen what role Iran will play in the future or not. I mean, at this point in time, because we don't know. But I think one of the overarching fears, and quite legitimately, and we'll come on to reasons why, that Syria could end up in a civil war on many fronts. Now, obviously, these opposition forces have taken control of Damascus. I know clearly the Russians are concerned about this, the Iranians are. And, you don't want some kind of very strange wars, and maybe 2 or 3 different wars all happening simultaneously within Syria, which could lead, of course, to the partial or complete collapse of the country. And maybe then, as I said, the risk is you have different elements in with HTS could end up against a resurgent Islamic State, which might happen, and they end up at war with each other. And then there's a kind of war between those two going on in parts of Syria, while there's supposed to be this interim government trying to, make some changes that are positive for the future of the Syrian people. I mean, quote unquote, because, as I said, that may not transpire to be the case. But I think just, and my initial thoughts will go on to other thoughts about what's going to unfold there. But you can kind of get the understanding that when you have different moderate rebels with different backers who actually fundamentally dislike each other, and that's being polite, present in a country, you can see why that alone could cause these kind of quasi-civil wars going on. And that would be absolutely devastating for the Syrian people, who will undoubtedly be caught in the proverbial crossfire in the process.
Yeah, I think you hit on a great point, because, one of the things about Syria, obviously, before this, the last 10, 11 days of conflict and overthrow, regime change, is that there were so many different elements in there. There were the Kurds, there were the Turks, there was the US base, there was Russians. You have some elements that were backed by Western intelligence agencies. You had others that were backed by the NATO and the Pentagon. And they're all on different sides, and they all have different agendas and what they want to come from this. So the potential of the civil war, you could have 3 different outcomes. You could have what happened in Rwanda, where after their civil war, they ended up bringing in the Chinese and helped rebuild the country, and it's actually becoming quite prosperous country. You could have Libya 2.0, where these factions fight each other. There's no thought about holding a sovereign state together, and it's just about seizing power for, at the lowest levels of humanity, and nothing, it just becomes a cesspool and a wasteland. Or you could potentially have a balkanization, like what happened in Yugoslavia after NATO got a hold of it. So there's so many different outcomes that could come from this, depending upon where the leadership decides that they want to, they want to facilitate this. You have to address all of the demands of the different players, what Turkey wants, what Russia may want, what the U.S. wants. The U.S. got rid of Assad. Hey, is that the end of their goal and their hegemony? Who knows? Israel wants Iran out of there. Well, if Iran moves away and they make agreements that they'll go ahead and pull out, well, then Israel gets satisfied. And hopefully that's the crux of it. The question is going to be is what, as you pointed out, what does this government look like it wants to do at the onset? And more importantly, how quickly are they going to be able to get the other players involved and see about rebuilding a country that's been devastated for more than 2 decades?
Yeah, absolutely. And let's look at Turkey. I mean, Turkey is interesting because there was always this kind of idea that Erdogan had designs on Idlib, Aleppo. There's a place called Tal Rifat, which is like an east-west connection for the Kurds. He wanted to basically take control and put a squeeze on the Kurds in this region. I mean, the risk is that this could spill over into a kind of war between the Kurds and Turkey. Maybe Turkey wants to take control of parts of northern Syria. Maybe they don't. Maybe the Kurds want to and think they can form another state like Kurdistan in Iraq, for example. And that could have Western support because the United States, as we know, been supporting the Kurds there, who then, have been effectively stealing the oil and the grain in Syria. What's going to happen in that region? And, so in a broader sense, it's difficult to know what the outcome will be. And this could end up blowing up very badly in Turkey's face in the process. And we don't know to what extent, they were involved in this process, and has this process now sort of blown out of control with regards to Israel. It's worth noting, yeah, for sure, they've gone and taken more territory. They're calling it a buffer zone near the Golan Heights. They intend to keep that in the future or try to? There's going to be international backlash, or are they just there on a temporary basis? And I know people will fundamentally suggest that's not the case. The other thing is they've been heavily bombing parts of Syria, even though Iran's not really there and Assad's gone. But they're trying to basically demilitarize anything that's left of Syria. And their motivation seems to be very clear why they're doing that. With the United States, yeah, they're protecting Kurds east of the Euphrates, but not west. The US doesn't want to start putting more forces in. The US wants to get out of Syria. I think Trump would want to do it. He talked about it last time. Okay, it never happened. We know why. Maybe that will happen in the future, where Trump will say we want out, but then who's going to protect the Kurds? And and this is what happens when you have so many different factions, so many different entities in a country who, frankly, shouldn't really be there anyway. The only countries that, well, okay, Assad's gone, so it's different now. No one has a right to really be there. But previously, it was only Iran and Russia. Turkey had no right to be there, but then they signed this agreement to do with Idlib, and hence the frozen conflict. But certainly, I think there is a fear in the United States and a fear that this could then spill over into other regions. And, you might see a resurgence, as I said, of the Islamic State and all the various forms that exists. I mean, there's so many different, and this is the problem. It's hard to keep up with all these different splinter groups who suddenly have a different perspective on things. There's no joined up thinking amongst these so-called moderate rebel groups, and that could spill over into a huge problem. And then, of course, I think the Israelis think, well, this will cut off all the supplies to Hezbollah because now Assad's gone. Because obviously the Iranians supply Hezbollah, it goes via Iraq into Syria and then into Lebanon. Well, they'll feel like, well, that will probably end. It probably won't, because there's going to be absolute chaos in this country for the foreseeable future. I mean, you try to get some governance structure in, but even when Assad was in, the country was, parts of it was totally out of control of the Syrians, as we said, with northeast Syria and the US and the Kurds. So that's an enormous problem that may continue. And what future role does Iran have in this country? What does that mean for Lebanon and Hezbollah? Okay, because of the argument is if they're cut off from supply, then I don't think it's the end of Hezbollah, but it could seriously impact their ability to do whatever they want to do. And the question therefore is what happens in that regard. Obviously, there was an expectation that all these countries would rush to support Assad, like the Iraqis, the Hezbollah, and the Iranians. They didn't. But if the agreement is, well, we didn't get involved previously because we anticipated a moderate government, we anticipated rebuilding the country. If that doesn't happen, then you might start seeing the Iraqis, the Iranians, and the Hezbollah piling into Syria. And who are they going to be fighting? Then are they going to end up going into Idlib and at war with Turkey, who's a NATO member? Okay, that Turkey's in a part of the world that doesn't belong to them. It belongs to Syria, so that changes the whole dynamic also. And could this then spill over into Turkey itself? Maybe it could end up seeing Turkey lose control of Idlib. That's a possibility. So, and you're absolutely right with the risk of a balkanization of Syria is self-evident. I mean, that could easily happen, and it gets broken up in, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 pieces. And, so I think there's a lot of people jumping to conclusions, and I'll come on to that shortly, so you can obviously chip in as well, Ken.
Yeah, there's obviously we don't want to go too much into speculation, but we'll take a piece of what happened yesterday, at least. Obviously, soon to be in a second term, President Trump was in Paris for the rechristening of Notre Dame. And one of the things he did afterwards was he did an interview and he was asked about Syria. And he said, why do we want to be there? He said, we have one terror group fighting another terror group. Let them fight each other. We don't need to be there. There's no purpose to be there. So he's reiterating what he wanted during his first administration and what you said that his intentions likely are. But with that being said, the one thing that has been happening in the past few weeks is that the individuals running the Biden administration are wanting to escalate war and chaos in multiple different places before Trump takes over, to sort of lock him into this endless war cycle versus what he wants to do of more isolationism, whether pull back from NATO, pull back from places we shouldn't be, etc. So you have that sort of push and pull going on. How much of it is true? Well, all we have to do is look at what Trump tried to do and what he did accomplish by going into 0 new conflicts, and what happened in the Obama administration and then subsequent Biden administration, where they were fomenting chaos all around the world as much as they could do. So who's right, who's wrong? We already have the evidence of what their past history is. So that's the U.S. side. And then taking a look at Russia's side, well, Russia is being accused in the media, at least by the propaganda media. Oh, Russia couldn't defend their ally because they're weak. They've been weakened. They can't even take Ukraine. Blah blah blah. No, I think Peskov came out and said it succinctly. The Syrian military does not have the will to even defend themselves. We're sure not going to spend manpower and arms to do it, to fight for a government that doesn't want to survive. So Russia's sitting there, and I think they did the absolute best thing. They did a little aerial bombing as support for some civilians that were trying to escape, and they just left it at that. They didn't get involved. So they're going to be at the table when discussions are being made what's going to happen with Syria. They're going to be at the table with respect and authority, because they want what's good for Syria, not for a hegemonic or a geopolitical control over that country.
Yeah, I mean, also, they were bombing the so-called moderate rebels in the process, absolutely, as well. I mean, in support of Assad, but they gave up and went, well, you don't want to defend your country. We're not going to do this anymore. And of course, that stopped. I mean, what the role Russia has and Iran in the future. They could both be told, sorry, you're not welcome in this country. We don't want you here, and they have to leave. But then the argument should have also applied to Turkey and the United States. If they start to look like they're just going, well, Western NATO type countries can stay here, then the risk is that the people inside Syria might end up not being particularly happy about this. You have to also bear in mind, I think there's going to be a huge amount of shock inside the country as to how rapidly these developments have happened. One thing I didn't mention, which we should have mentioned, there isn't just the HTS in there. I mean, okay, and aside from the Islamic State, there's actually an organization which is called the SNA. That's the Syrian National Army. That's supposed to be a Turkish-funded kind of rebel organization. That was operating in the Kurdish forces or targeting them north of Aleppo, near the Turkish border. Now, the question is, what role are they going to play? And does this mean that they could end up spilling over into northeast Syria? So, again, this is another one of these enormous problems. And the question is this interim government going to want the removal of the Kurdish forces or the Kurds out of Syria? Where are they going to go? They certainly won't be welcome in Turkey. I mean, and you just start to get an understanding, and from the US perspective, this may surprise people to say this, but there are certainly indications, I wouldn't say categorical indications, that the US was caught out rather surprised by this as well. They weren't really aware of this happening. And because I would have thought they would have gone, well, yes, we're not happy with Assad being president. Of course they weren't. But, they pretty much allowed the status quo to exist as it was. They were enforcing those hugely draconian Caesar Act, which was about causing huge problems to the Syrian people in terms of sanctions. And yes, they were there stealing the oil and allowing the Kurds to do it, and some profit sharing, agreement between the two parties, the Kurds and the US. They didn't have many forces there. But the question is now, given what's happening, this might all change, and things could get a lot worse for the US. And of course, the risk is, as we said, this could spill over into a problem that could engulf the region. Not every country is going to get involved. The Saudis won't, the Jordanians won't, etc., etc. But there is a risk that the players who've been in there to varying degrees over the last decade might end up all starting to get involved in a conflict that turns into a really ugly war in the country. And we have to hope against hope that is that doesn't transpire. But there is a risk it could do so. And this is why this is far more complicated. There are no simple answers to this. There's no simple ideas. Well, it was the US, Israel, and Turkey responsible, and they want this to happen, and they want that to happen. And of course, just a final point from me. There was claims a long time ago, part of the reason they wanted rid of Assad is they wanted to build energy pipelines from Qatar through Saudi Arabia, and up through Syria, of course, and into Lebanon. And this will be connecting up with a sort of energy hub in Turkey, which was to provide energy to Europe. And of course, that would then be seen as a challenge to the Russians and as an argument that might come to pass. But that's a hugely problematic project in itself. It doesn't mean it's going to happen, and people are reaching an assumption, well, that this is now going to happen just because there was some statement previously that there was an idea that someone wanted that to happen. So be very careful in making assumptions, because there is so much water under the bridge till they even get to that point. And also, since those ideas were talked about 15 more years ago, the world's changed a lot. I mean, Qatar's already exporting huge amounts of LNG to other countries. And it might not be in the position to want to do this anymore politically anyway. And we have to be, as I say, just mindful the world's ever changing. There isn't this idea the world's always the same and it's the same people and nothing ever changes. It's extremely fluid. And the last few years alone prove that. So be careful in coming to assumptions and conclusions about exactly who's involved and to what extent they're involved. The next 2 or 3 months will give us a better indication of what's going on, because certainly Turkey is talking a lot to Russia, and they're talking to this interim government, as is Iran, and they're all talking, the Turks and the Russians together as well. So let's see what the fallout is, what happens domestically in the country, and ultimately what happens with all the potential flashpoints as well, which will have to disappear, because there's no point having a continuation of that after putting some transition government in and then some other elected government. But I'm not saying the West won't control this and it won't be that's ultimately the goal. We don't know at this point. But I think it's very telling that there was no one at the negotiating table in Doha from the West. I mean, arguably, yes, Turkey is the West in inverted commas, but there was no other players. They're not decision makers. The other kind of Arab countries were involved in discussions, clearly. So let's see what unfolds, and it might turn out to not be what we would immediately assume to be. And, maybe a miracle will happen and country will become a sovereign nation. But it's a huge, tall order, and I'm not just blindly suggesting that's going to happen, of course.
Absolutely. And you never know if there was some timing that was put on certain leaders to have to do something. Obviously, this week, Netanyahu, the central court, demanded that he go up for trial and potentially for his corruption charges. So it's in his interest to keep the wars going, at least to the short to middle term. We have Turkey that's got millions of Syrian refugees that they need to deal with at a time when their economy is in the tank, and he's been trying to get Assad to come to some type of agreement over the Kurds and over the issue with the refugees for some time, and all these things came to a head. So, this on the flip side, this could be something that was just it's have partial organic, partial timing, and then partial intention. And then as you said, the most important thing that's going to happen is to see what happens in the aftermath going forward for all the different players. Anyway, Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of this great discussion and for your insight.
Yeah, and likewise.
And for everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you for all of your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.